Hi, my name is Ruth Ye, and I am the Teacher Mentorship and Leadership Specialist at TEA. Welcome to the Mentor Program Allotment Cycle 2 LEA Application webinar. In this webinar, we will provide an overview of the Mentor Program Allotment and the application itself. This Cycle 2 application is for LEAs interested in implementing MPA in the school year 2021 to 22. This webinar will cover the following topics: a Mentor Program Allotment overview, the Cycle 2 LEA application, and additional resources. Throughout this presentation, the use of the term LEA, or Local Education Agencies, refers to both districts and open enrollment charter schools. Here is a helpful visual of the Cycle 2 LEA timeline, starting with the application window in November and December. LEAs will be notified of Cycle 2 application decisions in February of 2021 to allow for LEAs to begin planning within the spring of 2021. Depending on the LEA, summer mentor training may occur sometime in July or August to kick off MPA implementation. This timeline does not imply mentor training would occur over 2 months in the summer. Here is a more specific timeline for the Cycle 2 LEA application process. The application window was open starting on November 2nd, 2020. All application materials were posted to the MPA website at www.tea.texas.gov/MPA. Following a similar process to other TEA grants, the application window includes a window for frequently asked questions to be submitted. Questions must be submitted in writing to the MPA email inbox by November the 18th. During this time, TEA cannot directly answer LEA questions. Instead, TEA will post an FAQ by December the 2nd to the MPA website in response to questions that were submitted. Refer to the Cycle 2 LEA application guidelines for more information. As mentioned, LEAs will also receive a notification letter about application decisions in February of 2021. To provide some brief context for the Mentor Program Allotment, mentoring statute existed prior to House Bill 3. Based on recommendations made by the Texas Teacher Mentoring Advisory Committee, legislature then adopted ideas for improving mentoring practices across Texas. House Bill 3 now includes MPA funding and its requirements as outlined in statute and rule. When applying for and implementing MPA, it is important to keep these two definitions in mind. As defined in statute, beginning teachers refer to teachers who have less than 2 years of teaching experience in the grade or subject they are assigned. This definition includes teachers such as first-year teachers and veteran teachers who may have 15 years of teaching experience but may be teaching a different grade or subject than what they have previously taught. However, due to limited state funds and high attrition rates of new teachers, the Cycle 2 funding formula prioritizes beginning teachers who have less than 2 years of teaching experience overall, meaning teachers who are in their first or second year of teaching. For teachers to be considered mentor teachers through MPA, they must meet the following requirements as listed: have 3 years of teaching experience with a proven track record, demonstrate strong interpersonal and leadership skills, be current classroom teachers, and teach at least 4 hours daily. LEAs can refer to statute and rule for a full representation of the requirements, including that mentor teachers must hold an appropriate certificate issued by the State Board for Educator Certification if the mentor teacher works in a school district, or must meet the qualifications of the employing charter school if the mentor teacher works in an open enrollment charter school. Some other mentor teacher requirements and responsibilities will be discussed later in this presentation. Mentoring topics as outlined in statute and rule include the following 5 topics: orientation to the context, policies, and practices of the LEA, data-driven instructional practices, coaching cycles, professional development, and professional expectations. Mentor teachers are expected to address all of these topics during mentoring meetings with each beginning teacher that is assigned to them. Statute also indicates that mentors and staff that support beginning teachers must complete a training that is approved by the commissioner and research-based, rooted in best mentorship practices, and occurs before the beginning of the school year as well as throughout the year. This training can either be LEA-created or through an approved provider. As further clarified within the application and guidelines, the best mentorship practices are aligned to the following 5 major topics: effective mentoring partnerships, coaching cycles, data-driven instructional practices, lesson planning, and learning environment. LEAs must cover and demonstrate these topics and best mentorship practices within their application, as will be described later in this presentation. As mentioned on the previous slide, mentors must complete a research-based mentor training program approved by the commissioner. This breakdown demonstrates the high-level overview of changes made between Cycle 1 and Cycle 2 for mentor training options. The first bullet has stayed consistent between Cycle 1 and 2, allowing for LEAs to be approved for an LEA-created training program through their application. LEAs may also still partner with an MPA-approved provider from the list, which has expanded from 2 to 7. The list of approved providers and their program information can be found on the MPA website. One significant change has been the last bullet. For Cycle 2, LEAs cannot apply for approval with an external partner that is not on the approved provider list. Refer to the Cycle 2 LEA application guidelines for more information about mentor training options. To further clarify the previous slide, applying LEAs have 2 main options for providing mentor training: using an LEA-created mentor training or partnering with an MPA-approved provider. Within option 2 of partnering with an approved provider, there are 2 sub-options: either having the approved provider provide mentor training only, or provide mentor training along with implementation and coaching supports. Implementation and coaching supports might differ between LEAs and could look like an approved provider helping the district with planning or implementation, such as scheduling release time. Approved providers could also provide coaching supports directly to mentor teachers through watching them lead coaching meetings, conducting observations with them, and debriefing observations. It is important to note that LEAs that apply with option 1 must be approved through the application process, while LEAs that apply with option 2 provide minimal additional information in their application. For those interested in applying for option 2 for mentor training, LEAs can visit the MPA website for more program information of the 7 approved providers as shown on this slide. These approved providers have already been through a rigorous vetting process for high-quality mentor training and supports. They will provide LEAs with a pre-approved mentor training scope and sequence for part of the application that will be discussed in more detail later in this presentation. Outside of training, mentor teachers must meet for mentoring sessions with each beginning teacher assigned to them. Mentoring sessions could refer to a mentor observing the beginning teacher or meeting with the beginning teacher to work on lesson plans, analyze student work, or more. In order to meet this requirement, LEAs must provide both mentors and beginning teachers with either release time or a reduced teaching load. LEAs must also designate a specific time during the regular school day for these mentoring sessions to occur for a total minimum of 12 hours per semester. This specific time must occur outside of the 45 minutes of teacher planning time as indicated in Texas Education Code. MPA funds can be used to cover the costs associated with this release time, such as substitute coverage. To clarify, LEAs do not need to use a reduced teaching load or release time for mentor training. This only applies to mentoring sessions. When considering mentor training options, it is also worth noting the Cycle 2 funding formula. LEAs approved for funding will be funded in allotment according to the breakdown provided. Option 1 LEAs will be funded at $1,500 per beginning teacher. Option 2 LEAs for mentor training only will be $2,000 per beginning teacher. And Option 2 LEAs for mentor training along with implementation and coaching supports will be funded $2,500 per beginning teacher. This formula is based on an analysis of LEA-related and approved provider mentor program costs. Adjustments from the Cycle 1 funding formula were made to account for the expanded approved provider list for mentor training and the possible inclusion of implementation and coaching supports. As a reminder, the Cycle 2 funding formula applies only to beginning teachers who have less than 2 years of teaching experience overall. In addition to the funding formula, LEAs approved for an allotment will be capped at 55 beginning teachers. Charter networks with multiple LEAs have the same cap and must indicate in their application which LEAs will implement MPA funding. All LEAs will provide a beginning teacher estimate for school year 2021 to 22 in their application, which will be used to calculate funding. Any funding differences between the estimate and the actual beginning teacher numbers will then be reconciled during the September 2022 settle up process. Here is an example of an LEA, in this case Azalea ISD, that is implementing MPA funding and reconciling funds through the settle up process. In this example, Azalea ISD estimates to having 15 beginning teachers for the 2021 to 22 school year. TEA determines that AISD meets the review criteria through their Cycle 2 application and finds that the assigned priority points are sufficient for AISD to receive funding. TEA then funds AISD a total of $30,000 based on 15 beginning teachers in partnership with an MPA-approved provider for mentor training only, in other words, $2,000 per beginning teacher. At the end of the school year 2021 to 22, AISD submits in their end-of-year compliance report that they only had 13 beginning teachers, or 2 less than the estimate. Through the September 2022 settle-up process, funding is reconciled and TEA recovers $4,000 from AISD. This example demonstrates what would happen if there are less beginning teachers than anticipated. But if the opposite is true, where there are more beginning teachers than estimated, TEA will flow additional funds up to the 55 beginning teacher cap through the same September 2022 settle-up process. As indicated in statute, LEAs approved for MPA funding may use funds in the following ways: support for mentors through providers of mentor training, release time for the mentor teacher and beginning teacher such as through substitute coverage, and mentor stipends. Since MPA funding may not fully cover the needs of the mentor program, LEAs may seek additional sources of funds like the ones listed: Title IIA funding, school improvement grants, and any other local funding sources. This presentation has provided a general overview of MPA and the requirements and statute associated with it. It is not an exhaustive list, so LEAs are encouraged to reference these pieces of statute and application reference materials for more information and detail before applying. Moving on to the application itself, we will discuss the following documents. The reference materials include the guidelines, scoring guide, and scope and sequence model. Reference materials are meant to provide guidance in filling out the application and implementing the mentor program using MPA funds. On the other side, the 4 application components have remained the same between Cycle 1 and 2, but their content and formatting have changed. Before we begin, we encourage you to download and review the various documents, which can be found at the MPA website. Feel free to pause and gather all necessary documents before proceeding with this webinar. The first reference material is the guidelines for the Cycle 2 LEA application. This table of contents provides a quick overview of the topics covered in the document. LEAs are encouraged to use these guidelines as a reference tool that may provide answers about the application as you complete and submit it for review. The topics are listed here. At the end of the guidelines document, you will find several appendices that include helpful resources and information to consider while applying for MPA. The next reference material is the scoring guide. We encourage LEAs to print or view this document online while filling out the application. The scoring guide provides specificity around the required components and common pitfalls to avoid. All required components must be met as they are rooted in statute and will be used to review the application. An LEA may score 1 point for any complete response that meets the requirements of this scoring guide. If a response is incomplete or does not abide by the listed requirements, an LEA will score 0 points for that question or section. LEAs who qualify for funding based on their priority points and available state funds must score a minimum total of points, which will be broken down on the next slide. Refer to the MPA guidelines for more information. As mentioned, the application will be scored on a binary basis, with either 1 point meeting the requirements or 0 for incomplete and not meeting the requirements. LEAs that are using an LEA-created mentor training must earn a total of 4 points to qualify, while LEAs partnering with an MPA-approved provider must only earn 3 points. In other words, LEAs must receive full credit for each item that is scored to be eligible for funding depending on which option an LEA is choosing. This difference can be seen in the research or evidence-based section, which does not need to be completed by option 2 LEAs since the scope and sequence has already been approved by TEA and will be provided to the LEAs as part of the scope and sequence section of the application. For LEAs using an LEA-created mentor training program, a scope and sequence model is provided to demonstrate how one row of the scope and sequence template can be completed. The model describes one 6-hour day or day 2 of a 3-day training and does not serve as a complete attachment B. It is meant as a guide to demonstrate how the required components can be met and how mentors can be trained successfully. Annotations are also provided for specific parts of the model to provide further clarity and rationale. Now that we have discussed the reference materials, we will move on to the application itself. The components are as listed here. The first component is the application attachment, or Attachment A. In this Word document, LEAs will answer questions that include narrative responses. The application is grounded in statute and rule for the mentor program allotment. When completing the application, we recommend that LEAs reference the MPA guidelines and scoring guide as discussed in the reference materials. Each section of the application lists the required components as seen in the scoring guide, and will be especially helpful in considering what to include in the narrative responses. The sections of the Attachment A application include assurances, time for mentoring sessions, mentor training, and research or evidence base of mentor training. Once you have completed this part of the application, save it to your computer. You will upload it later into the Qualtrics online submission, which will be discussed later in this presentation. In order to meet the requirement of 12 hours per semester for mentoring sessions, LEAs must provide a designated time during the school day for mentor teachers and beginning teachers to meet. This section of Attachment A is where LEAs will indicate which of the 2 methods they will use, reduced teaching load or release time. LEAs will also need to indicate who and how these mentoring sessions will be centrally coordinated and monitored. As indicated in the application and scoring guide, this section of the application must meet these required components to receive the full 1 point. This section must outline an intentional and reasonable plan using either release time or a reduced teaching load so that mentored and beginning teachers can meet for mentoring sessions for 12 hours per semester. Specify a time during the regular school day that is not during teacher planning time, and demonstrate a centrally coordinated and monitored approach. While we understand that LEAs may rely on principals and campus leadership to create campus-specific plans, there will still need to be evidence of coordination and monitoring across campuses. As indicated in statute, mentor training must be rooted in best mentorship practices. A table of training topics and best mentorship practices are provided in Attachment A. This table further defines what those best mentorship practices are and align to the 5 main training topics which were mentioned in a previous slide. For LEAs that are using an LEA-created mentor training, they must refer to this table while filling in their scope and sequence for Attachment B and describing the research or evidence base of their mentor training. As mentioned on the previous slide, another scored section of Attachment A encompasses the research or evidence base. This section of Attachment A must only be completed by LEAs who are using an LEA-created mentor training program. These LEAs must fill in the provided charts to describe the research or evidence base of the mentor training. There will be 2 charts for this section, one designated for the content of the training and the other for the design and delivery of the training. Content refers to the what, while the design and delivery to the how of training. It is worth noting that the research base for the design and delivery of the training may not be specific to mentoring and should reflect general research-based best practices for designing and facilitating professional development. Each chart will have space for up to 5 sources. This does not indicate a minimum number. Rather, it is meant for LEAs to highlight the most relevant sources of research or evidence that influence the training, content, design, and delivery. LEAs will also have the option to provide the hyperlinks for the sources where additional information can be found. LEAs using an LEA-created mentor training program must meet these required components to receive the full 1 point as indicated in the application and scoring guide. They must cite and describe the research or evidence base as opposed to just listing the sources. They must provide context for how the research or evidence base influenced both the content and design and delivery of the training. A common pitfall from Cycle 1 was the lack of context for how the research or evidence base was clearly connected to and impacted the training. The context must describe how the research or evidence base leads to effective training aligned to the best mentorship practices. The research or evidence base must also demonstrate clear alignment to the scope and sequence. This section of the application must clearly connect to the scope and sequence provided as Attachment B. We are now going to move on to Attachment B, the scope and sequence of mentor training. To meet the mentor training requirement of statute, LEAs have one of 2 options, either using an LEA-created mentor training or partnering with an MPA-approved provider through training only or training with coaching and implementation supports. This is where LEAs that are using an LEA-created mentor training will fill in the scope and sequence template. LEAs are also encouraged to reference the scope and sequence model as mentioned, which will provide effective guidance on how one row of the template can be filled out. This model reflects the required components and demonstrates successful mentor training. LEAs partnering with an approved provider will use the scope and sequence provided by the approved provider and fill in LEA-specific information such as tentative training dates. The scope and sequence for all LEAs must reflect the required components outlined in the scoring guide. All LEAs must meet the required components to receive the full 1 point for Attachment B. For LEAs using an LEA-created mentor training, the scope and sequence as Attachment B must be completed using the template provided and must meet the required components as partially shown on this slide. The scope and sequence must describe the program and outcomes in detail as demonstrated through the scope and sequence model, effectively develop the mentor teacher's knowledge, skills, and mindsets, include a training before the beginning of the school year and once per semester, indicate a minimum total of 18 hours of mentor training, and cover and align to the 5 required training topics. As continued from the previous slide, the scope and sequence for LEA-created mentor trainings must also dedicate time and provide meaningful opportunities for mentor teachers to practice, and evaluate mentor skill development. These required components are all demonstrated through the scope and sequence model. Common pitfalls from Cycle 1 included the lack of sufficient time and opportunities to meaningfully practice, and evaluating mentor knowledge and perceptions only, instead of mentor skill development. The last possible attachment for the application is Attachment C, the Campus Implementation List. This Excel spreadsheet is only required for LEAs who are planning to use MPA funding on a subset of their campuses and will not be scored. Refer to the MPA guidelines for further details. As noted in the MPA guidelines, LEAs may choose to use MPA funds to implement mentor programs on a subset of campuses. For instance, in Scenario 1, the LEA has a total of 5 campuses, which have the economically disadvantaged percentages as listed. This means the LEA average is 53%, which assigns them 5.3 priority points for the economically disadvantaged category. In Scenario 2, the same LEA only wants to use MPA funding to support beginning teachers at Title I schools because that is where the greatest need is for support. TEA would only calculate the percentage of the economically disadvantaged population from those 3 campuses indicated in the campus implementation list, instead of the entire LEA's percentage. As you can see, the selected subset of Title I campuses now have an average economically disadvantaged student population of 74%, as opposed to the original LEA average of 53%, which would now assign 7.4 priority points. This is the average TEA would use to determine the LEA's priority points for economically disadvantaged. To summarize, LEAs may apply for MPA funding on a subset of campuses, as indicated through Attachment C, which may affect the overall priority points for funding. Once all MPA application components are completed and saved, you will fill out the Qualtrics online application. This is where LEAs will answer a set of brief questions and upload all necessary attachments. Upon submission, applicants will receive a confirmation email with a response summary. They will have the ability to make changes and updates up to the application deadline. Confirmation emails will also be sent to the applicants and TEA every time a submission is updated. It is important to note that the Cycle 2 funding formula defines beginning teachers as teachers with less than 2 years of teaching experience overall. In Question 6 of the Qualtrics, LEAs will need to indicate the number of beginning teachers in previous years and the estimate with which the LEA intends to implement the mentor program allotment, reflecting this Cycle 2 funding formula definition. If there is a significant difference between previous years and the estimate, LEAs will need to indicate why within this question. Once all required documents have been completed, you will need to upload all these attachments to Qualtrics. Remember to use the appropriate file types and naming conventions as described within the application. Attachments A and B are required for all LEAs, while Attachment C is only required if your LEA intends to implement MPA on a subset of campuses. As a reminder, please keep in mind that you will need to have completed all application files prior to completing the Qualtrics part of the application process. The following are additional resources that LEAs can review as they complete the MPA application. As mentioned, this presentation provided a general overview and is not a complete representation of the MPA and its requirements. The left-hand side of this slide refers to the relevant sections of statute and rule that describe the statutory requirements. The other resource to consider is the FAQ document that will be posted to the MPA website. As mentioned, LEAs may submit written questions to the MPA email inbox up until November the 18th. TEA will then post responses to the frequently asked questions to the MPA website on December 2nd. This is to ensure a fair competitive advantage among prospective applicants. Thank you for watching this webinar. If you have any questions, you may contact us at mpa@tea.texas.gov or visit the MPA website for more information.